Hello, and thank you for taking the time for my thesis presentation. Over the past 7 months, I have been studying globalization and its effect on the world's economies. More specifically, I have focused on the economic inequalities created by neoliberalism. To start, I would like to give a brief history and definition of neoliberalism, as it will be a central ideal of this presentation. As the world has advanced technologically and economies have globalized, the international exchange of capital and goods has become an increasingly viable reality. Neoliberalism is the economic ideal that anything that gets in the way of this flow of goods and capital should be minimized as much as possible. Trade liberalization, mass privatization, and general economic austerity are defining characteristics of neoliberalism, and they all contribute to the free flowing of goods and capital from country to country. Neoliberalism began to take root as Keynesianism failed in the 1970s, and as the regimes of Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK came into power, the economic superpowers fully embraced the economic policy. As the US moved into the post-Cold War era, economic policy centered around deregulation and empowering the individual became very attractive. Taxes were lowered, trade tariffs were abolished, and public entities were privatized in an effort to stimulate the economy internationally. In the subsequent decades, neoliberalism would go on to widen the income gap considerably across the world and create extreme economic inequalities between developing countries and the superpowers of the world today. My thesis is centered around the idea that economic powers were considerably more equipped to handle the globalized economy and neoliberalism, and as a result, were able to take advantage of developing countries exploiting their labor, markets, and resources. In my thesis, I'll be presenting on 3 countries, Mexico, Argentina, and Bangladesh, and their experiences with neoliberalism to show that they were supremely taken advantage of for the profit of the US and other European powers. World economic organizations like the World Bank, WTO, and IMF started off as groups designed to empower developing countries through loans and economic development, but have become tools for exploitation of the developing economies of countries like Argentina. Argentina has had an extremely long history with the IMF, taking out the largest loan in the fund's history, among others. After a failed war in the 1970s, Argentina was left with little capital and a lot of poverty. They turned to the IMF for help and began their journey into neoliberalism. Involvement with organizations like the IMF have been extremely dangerous because of the terms and conditions that come with the loans and advice. Countries taking loans from the IMF are often unable to meet the repayment requirements and must restructure. This is when the organization, backed by the economic powers of the world, impose neoliberal reforms in exchange for loan restructuring. These organizations are made up of representatives from countries like the US and UK who are strategically appointed. Under the guise of economic development, these officials are mainly concerned with the spread of neoliberalism over the prosperity of their partners. The transition to neoliberalism was disastrous for Argentina as they struggled to free themselves from the weight of their IMF loans. The country decided to employ a currency peg and strictly follow Washington consensus ideals as prescribed by the US and IMF. The country was unable to find any quality of life growth as trade liberalizations, open borders, and foreign investment allowed economic powers to exploit the developing economy very easily. This led to one of the world's major economic crashes in 2001 that came from Argentina's abandonment of the currency peg that left the peso extremely overvalued. The peg resulted in disaster because the strength of the Argentine economy was far below the US's, and the rapid devaluation of their currency left the country in a massive recession. In 2003, the country began to rebuild under Nestor and Cristina Kirchner as they began to distance themselves from neoliberal policies. Kirchner's import substitution model led to an annual 8% GDP growth and a poverty decrease of roughly 35%. This allowed the South American country to stabilize in the 2000s until growth slowed and inflation rose. New leadership brought Argentina back into the grips of the IMF and has launched the country into what some are calling the crisis after the short-lived presidency of Mauricio Macri. It is extremely surprising and disheartening to see the country fall back into the organization that caused so much harm in the late 1900s. And the results show that neoliberal organizations do nothing but hurt the countries that they supposedly support. In my next section, I talk about Mexico's experience with neoliberalism through the lens of the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA is an agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada that breaks down trade barriers between the three countries and allows for expanded market access starting in 1994. The deal was signed on the basis of equal expansion of trade markets for all three countries, but we have since learned that the benefits would be far from equal. Many boast about NAFTA's success, citing Mexico's GDP rise as a result of the agreement, but the other two countries in the agreement saw their GDP rise at double the rate of Mexico's. One of the main ways that the US and Canada began to take advantage of their developing counterpart was by entering their markets and completely taking over, kicking out local producers that held their place in the market for decades. One industry in particular that was impacted most dramatically was the agricultural industry. Prior to NAFTA, farms in Mexico were diverse and could adequately serve their respective communities. As it became much easier to access Mexican markets, US mega producers were able to ship their crops to Mexico and sell them at a much lower price than what local producers could. The technological advancements of American agriculture allowed them to fully price out domestic farmers from their own markets in Mexico. This caused around 1.3 million farmers to lose their job in the first 5 years of NAFTA and actually led to price increases in goods like corn tortillas, among others. Labor was impacted drastically as a result of NAFTA. As Mexicans were pushed out of their jobs in industries like agriculture, they were forced to join large factories along the border which produced goods for American consumption. NAFTA allowed the US to exploit Mexico's labor because of the lack of regulation and wage requirements. Millions were forced to uproot their families and move closer to the border to work in low-quality jobs. Neoliberals boast that NAFTA created over 5 million jobs in Mexico, but do not consider that almost all of these jobs were low quality and Mexicans were forced to take them as a result of their markets being exploited by American goods. Finally, illegal immigration increased exponentially when NAFTA was enacted. Millions of Mexicans are condemned for illegally crossing the US border in search of livable wages because their country cannot supply them. This is a major issue for all because illegal immigration is both dangerous for the immigrants and devastating to the domestic workforce as new labor can be obtained at a lower cost. In the end, NAFTA created huge gains for the richest individuals in the agreement. GDP grew in all countries, but the quality of work, markets, and life all decreased for Mexican workers. Economic indicators like these fail to tell the whole story, as most of the gain from these agreements went to the wealthiest individuals. By 2005, NAFTA had created 24 billionaires in Mexico, while millions lost their farms and income security. Mexico is a prime example of neoliberalism serving the 1% by exploiting the working class. My final section took me out of Latin America and into Southeast Asia to one of the world's largest producers of ready-made garments. Similar to Mexico, Bangladesh is a country whose labor patterns were changed dramatically as a result of neoliberalism. The country is one of the world's largest producers of these garments, exporting mostly to countries like the UK and the US, among others. The massive growth of this industry since the 1980s has done little for the people of Bangladesh, however, as the country's main competitive advantage in production is their low prices. However, the country nor the factory owners bear the weight of these low prices, low wages, and extremely dangerous factory conditions, as these burdens fall on the working class. Workers in these factories were majority women and regularly were forced to work 14-hour days, 7 days per week. Part of the reason why production is so cheap in Bangladesh is because of the lack of regulation that results from the developing infrastructure. Economic powers who have these restrictions in place look to exploit this labor for their own profit. This influence comes directly from neoliberalism because countries are able to exchange goods easily, therefore economic powers exploit the cheap labor easily as well. My section on Bangladesh also dives into the impact of NGOs in Bangladesh and their impact on the working class under neoliberalism. What started as organizations to empower women in the working class have become profit-making tools operating in the interest of foreign investment. NGO empires like Grameen Bank offer microfinances, which are loaning efforts available to people who may not have the means to borrow money traditionally. Grameen Bank, among others, takes advantage of poor working citizens, usually women, and offers these services under the guise of empowering the female entrepreneur. Bangladesh is an extremely patriarchal society, and women often do not have the final say in what these loans are used for. Women bear all the risk with none of the rewards. As a result of social pressure and pressure from the NGOs themselves, women are then forced to borrow more or sell valuable assets to keep up with loan repayment. One of the defining ideals for developing countries under neoliberalism is to make themselves as attractive as possible for foreign investment. These loans do that by boasting high recovery rates that leave the borrower in a considerably worse position than they began in. In my research, it has become abundantly clear to me that the world's economic superpowers have used neoliberalism to exploit developing countries for massive profit. In my opinion, there simply cannot be a neoliberal relationship between two unequal economies because the country in power will almost certainly take advantage of the weaker. While most developing countries who embrace neoliberalism experience a small surge in GDP, these types of economic metrics fail to tell the full story of quality of life. In Argentina, neoliberalism caused one of the biggest crashes in Latin American history. In Mexico, working conditions were considerably worsened as a result of NAFTA, and in Bangladesh, neoliberalism has caused the country to become extremely reliant on an industry that provides inadequate wages. Neoliberalism has yet to prove itself as an equitable and sustainable mode of economics. Income inequality is at an all-time high throughout the world as the richest people have been able to exploit the world's working class. In a time of social revolution, neoliberalism should be intensely targeted as it is at the roots of some of the world's biggest inequalities today. Thank you so much for taking the time.